Hey Dad, how much does it cost to get a sample garment made in Vietnam?
Okay, let's first differentiate between salesman samples and development samples.
Salesman samples, yeah, they are specifically for companies who go out on the road to sell their products. So they don't have their own retail shops, but they are selling to somebody else. They need a lot of samples, 10, 20 samples, one for each salesman, to take out and show their customers this is the product that you're going to buy.
And do they have to be perfect?
Absolutely. They have to be right to the button.
Versus development samples, don't they have to be perfect as well?
No, a development sample can be made out of a similar fabric, maybe the wrong color, but it's the right type of fabric. Or it's a button, and everybody knows that it's a 24-line button, but that's not the button we're going to use in production. And the zip can be not necessarily the right one for production, but it's a zip to show that there's going to be a zip in the product, where it's going to go, how it's going to look. So a development sample is very much, this is what it's going to look like.
Approximately how much do salesman samples cost versus the cost of development samples?
A salesman sample, I would estimate at about 3 times production.
Okay, 3 times the FOB price?
Yeah. Now a development sample, I would say they were 5 or 6 times.
Where do they get sample fabric from if the customer insists on having the actual fabric?
And it will be from the factory asking the mill or whoever is making the item, whether it's a zip, a button, the fabric, to say, right, can you rush through 1,000 buttons? Can you rush through 100 meters of the fabric? I need it to make my pre-production samples, my salesman samples. And the mills will do that. And that cost will be factored in to everything else that they do.
You got to look at it from both buying the yarn, knitting or weaving, and then dyeing. And it's just very expensive to do really ultra small volume of buying yarn, knitting, weaving, and dyeing. It can be done. It's just that the price of the fabric ends up being double what it would normally be for the higher MOQs. So that's why salesman samples are so expensive. But buttons and stuff, as long as the customer doesn't have buttons engraved with their logo, there's just a large variety of standard buttons that would meet the requirements of the customers, that they could go out and buy a bag of 50 pieces or 100 pieces of buttons. Same with zippers. You can go in China and Vietnam, you can go to the local market and find quite a variety of buttons and zippers that are sold wholesale.
The only problem with going to the local market is some of these international buyers want zips that are approved to a certain standard. And to get the zip approved to a certain standard, you need to buy it from a, inverted commas, reputable supplier who have been registered. That's not to say that your local market ones aren't good. They're probably very good.
Yeah. So in that case, the buyer just has to accept that the button looks like final button, but it's not certified yet. And I think that would suffice for salesman sample. And let's look at the labor cost component. Imagine that we're talking about a t-shirt. It's a really tricked out t-shirt at a fair price, so like $5. If you multiply $5 times 3.5, it's $17.50, right? So if you wanted, say, 20 salesman samples of this t-shirt, you'd have to pay $17.50 for each t-shirt. That's a lot of money for a salesman sample. So the question is, why is it so expensive? In a best case scenario, how many minutes does it take to sew one t-shirt?
I would guess, and it's a long time since I've done it, about 5 minutes, if that.
All right, so if it takes an average of 5 minutes to sew one t-shirt in a mass production sewing line where each person is focusing on one operation, they just do side seam over and over and over again, or armhole over and over and over again, then what is the standard value minute for a one-off t-shirt? So you have one person making the whole t-shirt, doing all the operations at one time. Is it going to be 5 minutes as well, or is it going to be more?
No, it's going to be probably 15, 20 minutes.
Right. So then that's where the labor cost component skyrockets, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not all done on the one machine. A t-shirt will be made on maybe 3-4 machines. So that one person has got to move from each machine. Every time they go on the machine, the thread color may not be correct, so they've got to change it. In mass production, they're making 500, 1,000 a day in the same color thread. So the girl is sat on the machine just sewing her one operation. She doesn't move, she doesn't change thread, she just bangs them out.
Let's talk about the difference in price of mass production versus sewing salesman samples or development samples in the context of cutting the fabric?
To do a sample, you need the fabric, you need the pattern, could be a paper pattern, could be a card pattern, in which case you chalk around the pattern onto the cloth, and then to cut it out, probably going to take you 15 minutes minimum.
And that's one layer of fabric.
That's one layer. When you go into bulk production, you're not cutting one layer of fabric, you're cutting multiple layers. Depending upon the thickness of the fabric, it could go as high as 100 layers of fabric, in which case, again, you're not using scissors, you're using something called a straight knife or a band knife to cut it out. You're cutting out, if it's, let's say, 50 thick, you're cutting out 50 garments more or less at a time. And to cut out those 50 takes seconds. To cut out a pair of jeans takes 15 minutes. A t-shirt, 15 minutes. Cut out 1,000 jeans takes an hour. Because you've stacked them up, you're cutting out multiple garments at a time using more automated machinery than you're doing with a pair of scissors. So the economy of scale is just vast.
So that's why just the cost of cutting is significantly higher when making one-off salesman samples or development samples. Does it make more sense to make your salesman or development samples in Asian countries like China, Vietnam, or India versus making them in the US or in Europe?
Right, I think it depends upon where you are in your own company's development. If you're a new upstarting company, then you're better making them locally. If you've been in business for 2 or 3 years, it will be better making them at the factory that is going to make your bulk production. They will know what you want. They will have access to more of the fabric, to more of the machinery that is necessary to produce a good quality garment.
We're making an assumption that whether we're talking about salesman samples or development samples, that they're going to get it right the first time. So how many times do you think it will take? How many samples of the salesman samples will they have to make before it's right?
Salesman samples, I would expect them to get it right first time. Development samples, anything up to 3, 4, 5 times.
Richard, should the cost of making either salesman samples or development samples be credited to the bulk order?
I think it should, yes. But if you've got a bulk order for 60,000 items, then the sample price just gets included into the cost.
Yeah, I would say it's totally negotiable. It's just a numbers game. Both sides should do the math. Okay, let's talk about the cost of shipping samples, like shipping the salesman samples or the development samples, like from China, India, or Vietnam over to, for example, the US. How much are we talking in terms of shipping costs?
Expensive, because you're going to air freight them more than likely.
Right.
You're not going to put your sample that you want quickly on a slow boat from China.
Exactly.
You're going to put it on an aeroplane, and
Yeah.
that's going to cost you, and with cost today, astronomical.
Yeah, I think like DHL, the minimum I believe is 5 kilograms. So if you're doing, let's say you had a total of 50 salesman samples, that's going to be a lot more than 5 kilograms. For like, if you had 50 salesman samples, air freight from Vietnam, I think the cost would be between $200 to $300.
It's going to be expensive to ship those samples, and it's getting more expensive, unfortunately.
Whereas if you're only shipping, like, let's say 5 kilograms or less, you're automatically, it's like $50 to $60 from Vietnam to US.
I would almost say it's getting cheaper to send somebody economy with 20 kilos of luggage carrying your salesman samples.
That's a good point. And I know that exists between Vietnam and Australia. There's an entrepreneur that works as a stewardess, and they created a little network, and they've got contact people on both in Australia and here in Vietnam. And if you just know the right person to call, you know where to drop it off. They have a flat rate and it works. So that is another option. Give us your best advice. How much does it cost, either salesman samples or development samples?
My best advice is that a salesman samples will be between 3 and 5 times your FOB price. A development sample, I think, is going to be more than that.